All right. I'm Evan Miyazono. I'm a researcher at Protocol Labs, and I think I'm the last session for the day, other than some closing remarks. And I'm not presenting results. I'm presenting an open problem statement. I think it's an interesting one, and hopefully I'll provide some interest or some useful food for thought as you go off to your own journeys thinking about consensus, and potentially give you new ways of thinking about old things or new things to think about. Overall, the basic idea is if part of your network goes away and goes off and does its own thing, can this come back? I also like to think of this as, can we unfork ourselves? And you'll probably, it's been mentioned already, but I wanted to emphasize that we like sharing open problem statements because I think that problems aren't shared enough in research. Generally, you get a lot of sharing of solutions, but if there's an important problem that could have a big impact, then we should go about sharing those. And so the research repo at Protocol Labs aims to be a place where we do more of that. Do you have a question?
Well, it's just, if you can unfork yourself, then doesn't that mean you weren't forked in the first place?
Sometimes you just feel forked. And maybe that's the difference. And so some of the cases in which we would share these open problems would be if we see people solving a special case of the same problem over and over, and we try and generalize that. There are also things that are wish lists of if we had this, we could do so much more. And then there are also what I'm calling the spotter's guide, where if in your journeys into consensus you come across a solution, we'd love to hear about it, because this mergeable consensus in particular seems like something where you might come across something that would be very close to a solution. The goal is to have these range in scope from something like an undergraduate senior thesis to a multi-year research effort for an entire group. And the hope is that people will contribute problems as much as they'll come and contribute solutions. You might know that Protocol Labs is kind of a blue sky organization in some respects. And so this is my personal home is the starry sky side of that. I go a little further, and so just wanted to have that as far as setting the tone for this. So maybe it should be said that this is a hypothetical problem, and that problem is what if your network is unintentionally split? And so if these are blockchains, can you ever merge these chains again? And the reason for asking this question now is that I think that scalability and block DAG like consensus protocols might actually satisfy some of the solution requirements that we would want out of this. And so if you're working on those, I'd love to have you keep these in mind to see if you can improve robustness against these things like transient network partitions. And I also wanted to highlight that consensus seemed to be originally built around avoiding forks or mitigating their impact rather than trying to make these undoable. And in general, I separate this problem into 3 different flavors. There's the sort of boring vanilla flavor that there's a shared root and the fork is recent. And this looks a lot like a block DAG type system, or something that expected consensus might be able to solve. You could have a more interesting version where you have a shared root and a long running partition for these chains. And then there's a flavor that's a little bit nuts, and that would be independent chains running the same protocol. Is it possible for these to ever merge? And so diving into this first one, if you could do this, you would be robust against intermittent eclipse attacks. And all you really want is that the attacker can't extract value from exploiting this fork and merge protocol. And so you could imagine a more brute force solution being something like the fork with less weight, voluntarily self/limit double spend, or just merges doubles the state of cryptocurrency or the smart contracts. And the reason for doing something like this would be, in theory, to increase the network value overall, because one big network should be able to do things better than 2 smaller networks. It should be more secure, more stable, and ideally you'd have better liquidity and a lower transaction cost. For the more interesting version, you also have this hope that you'd be able to reduce proliferation of forks to maybe some equilibrium number. Currently, this is just a ratchet. Projects can fork, and then the only way they go away is if they die. But in the current ecosystem, they tend not to be dying. And so at the current rate, we should just see a proliferation of forks everywhere. And in this case, you also would want, in a prolonged partition, you'd want to have some way of having reasonable way of valuing the relative tokens compared to each other, assuming there's some token associated with these blockchains. And as far as how you would go about thinking about that, there's a slide slightly later in the nuts version. So with this one, I'm going to claim that if you can solve this problem, you are robust against all Eclipse attacks, forking attacks, and possibly more. I can't prove that at this point. I hope to at some point, but I'll motivate the maybe more. As far as constraints, we also pick up the constraint that you would probably want to incentivize network merging to actually be robust against Eclipse attacks. And so when you think about what this merging would look like, you have the way in which you'd consider that was going to be based on what it is that you're trying to merge. If these are just account balances, then you have to find some way of valuing one chain's tokens relative to the other, and possibly slashing one of them completely, or finding some median way that everyone in the chain agrees with, or everyone in both chains agree with. If these are smart contracts, then you have to merge the virtual machine state, and you could do this in a way, or you could do this by forcing the people who are writing these smart contracts to make this mergeable. That's probably not something that anyone's going to want to do, but if you do this with something like CRDTs, as Juan mentioned, then every action is a pending of some operation, and the sequence of these operations give you a final state. And so if two smart contracts are running, all they are just long logs of operations. And so you can merge those because with the CRDTs, all the operations commute. And so the idea would be that the output state of the combined set would just be the combined set, or the outputs of combining two states would just be the combined state, trivially. And then as far as how to think about who decides this new state, I think there's a spectrum from your democracy like one subnet, one vote, to a metricocracy, where the protocol in some way decides what the weight should be. And on the democracy side, you have a merge all the states, and this fades into like a based on the number of nodes, or you get closer to a like how much work is in this, what is the quality of your proof of work ticket, or like how many files are actually being stored. And then I'm arguing that what's really interesting is that you can start diving into things like defining some exchange vector between these blockchains or subnets. And if you can do this, then you can do things like define what Sybil resistance is, because suddenly you can look at the network as a whole, and if it's providing some useful function, you can decide or determine, or some combination thereof, what is useful and what isn't, based on the actions that are happening in that subnet. And so if this were Filecoin, you could see, is this just some random accumulation of computers that are all storing files for themselves? Or is this a giant network where everyone is storing files for each other and asking for them, and the pattern looks very kind of biological and natural in the distribution of generation and requesting. And in this way, you can, and because this is done computationally, you can choose any combination or computation of these variables to decide what that is, or how to weight the relative chains. As far as how we're planning to go about solving this, the first step is to just formally define this problem, and that will be posted in our open problems repo. And after that, we may end up posting an RFP. This is something that we think is important enough to continue pursuing. And I encourage all of you to keep this somewhere in the back of your mind and come talk to me after this if you're interested in hearing more. Any questions?
Well, like a formally defined problem that would be actually important how you, maybe, I don't know, like,
Yeah, it is in the plans.
Yeah, I'll just add a comment that a lot of these things that we talk about, we can reason about each individual case and say, oh yeah, that's what you would do. But it's part of the goal is to make all of this programmatic, where all of those kinds of decisions of how two subnetworks would merge become contracts themselves and become automatic pieces of software that get invoked. And if you do that, then you can get into actually migrating state seamlessly, as opposed to right now where you would have to ad hoc do this for each individual subnet.
I feel like, if you can read contractors, you just CRBTs like kind of like artificial sort of you're proposing certain requirements on that.
Yeah, I mean, it would probably make more sense to have do something like Agoric, where you have the smart contracts and your virtual machine exist outside of the state of the blockchain itself, and you have references to it, and then you can find a more creative way to merge states of the references rather than merging the contracts.